From the intersection of 218 and 80, with rivers like our own, seek for seas they never find. I'm Aaron McNally, and this is Curiosity Now. Hello, Curiosity Now listeners. Thanks for being here, and thanks especially for clicking subscribe and like. With me today is Cassie Finley, doctoral candidate at the University of Iowa in philosophy. Cassie, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
Hey, great. It's really excellent to talk to you. I'm super excited to have a conversation, and I guess we could just jump right in if you're feeling up to it.
Yeah, sounds great.
I was hoping if it's suitable for your preferences that we might talk a little bit about ethics to start off the podcast. Is that cool with you?
Yeah, I'll do my best.
I know it's not your focus, but would you say that it's the case that you consider yourself to observe Nicomachean or Aristotelian ethics?
Yeah. So this is something I've been thinking about more. Um, in undergrad, I was studying philosophy. I stayed as far as possible from ethics. I didn't take a single ethics course beyond the absolute requirements. And it's really only in the last 6 months to a year that I've really started delving into ethics more and realizing, okay, maybe I should interact with this a bit more. And yeah, I'm finding that um, virtue ethics or Aristotelian ethics specifically has really gotten my heart, and it seems like the most intuitive, proper way of going about engaging with the world. I started undergrad, and we had a book assigned to every student at my university. And the book that we were assigned my year was The Most Good You Can Do by Peter Singer. And we brought Peter Singer out,
Sure.
and he spoke to the whole freshman class.
Oh,
And I
wow.
just remember being furious. I was so angry because it seemed so obvious that like this extreme utilitarianism that he's going for just felt wrong. It felt upsetting, and it didn't feel like it was mapping on what ought to be the way things were, or
Oh,
how
wow.
how things should be. So that was part of what turned me off of ethics, because I was like, well, if this is what ethicists are doing, I don't want to do that. But now I'm realizing, oh no, that's what ethicists are doing. We need to do something else.
Yeah, yeah.
That's sort of how that's come about.
Yeah, that's so interesting. One of the ways that I used to think about ethics before I really knew what it was I wouldn't have called this a philosophical distinction, but I had the idea of there was morality and then there was ethics. And, all of my morality came from like Catholic school as a kid. And I didn't go through Catholic high school. I didn't study any philosophy at all. But
Mhm.
I always thought morality was the thing where you know what's good or bad or whatever. Ethics is where you're like intellectual about it and you think about what's good or bad or right or wrong or what you should ought to do. It's like kind of the rationalization. But then, yeah, like you, when I started looking into deontology and Kantian ethics, and then I looked
Mhm.
at utilitarianism, that was like burnout city. what, what 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 in particular drove you crazy about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was, his good you can do is focused on effective altruism, and it's
Hmm.
basically maximizing the amount of good you can do in the world. And something
Sure.
felt wrong about the sacrifice demanded, like that I didn't want that out of a moral theory. That it seems like being a good person and doing good things needed to be separated, at least, in theory, right? So you
Oh,
can
wow.
try really hard, and if you fail, that's okay. um,
Hmm.
and the idea that, this moral theory that he's pushing is supposed to be one where you put everything aside to work a job that makes you miserable so that you can make more money, so that you can donate that money, and you can live on the absolute bare minimum and all that. It felt too
Sure.
extreme, and it didn't feel like the sort of thing that we can reasonably ask of people. right?
Sure. It's like when you look at the motivation for it, you can kind of understand the impetus. It's like try to do the most good and the least evil, right? So you how do I
Mhm.
quantify that, right? Well, the problem
Right.
is once you start to quantify that, you get in this endless system of everything being philosophical or but sort of politically philosophical, like every action that you do is some sort of like measurement of whether or not you're doing something properly or doing something the most best or whatever, which can be just exhausting, right? But perhaps people who are of particular mindsets that comes more naturally or something, but it certainly doesn't to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something I've been thinking about quite a bit recently. Um, and I finally got the name for it, but there's something called Goodhart's Law. And it actually started in economics, but then was generalized by someone else. But it's basically that once you use a measure of some outcome, that measure no longer becomes um, useful, right? So if
Fascinating.
you think about like, all right, well, we want to think about what makes actions good. How can we quantify that? How can we measure it, right? And so
Sure.
you say, well, the amount of good you can do, the amount of lives you can save. But then that becomes your target, right? So then you're thinking about, okay, well, I know I'm doing good if I am saving lives, as opposed to saving lives is a way to be good. So
Mhm.
it's no longer a good measure of, goodness or morality or ethics or whatever, because you have a new aim. You're aiming to fulfill the measures. So you see this in standardized
Mhm.
testing and things like that in education, right? Where
Sure.
they say, okay, well, we want our students to know these things. We want them to approach the world and think about things in certain ways. So we're going to quantify that and have it be a score on a test. And then that becomes the benchmark. So then teachers, you see this around. Teachers have to
Mhm.
start aiming to teach them the test rather than the content. And I think that that is
Yeah.
applicable in things like ethics, where, I'm a big fan of thinking that ethics are not properly codifiable, that you can't just quantify what's good and what's bad. Instead, you just have to aim for what's good, and yeah, you recognize that there are probably some markers, but they're not going to be the marker always. So I think that it's just overly simplified to think of things in quantifiable terms, especially for something as complicated as ethics.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so when you stumbled onto Aristotelian ethics, had you already been interested in Aristotle, or were you looking for an ethics?
Yeah, I mean, again, I really didn't engage with ethics much at all in undergrad, um, other
Sure.
than what was required. And I actually really didn't like Aristotle when I first came across him, my first couple of years of studying philosophy, because it just felt complicated and it
Uh-huh.
was dry, and
Mhm.
it was not interesting at all. And I really liked Plato. And at some point that completely flipped, and I got really into Aristotle's psychology. And so I ended up doing
Oh.
my undergrad, thesis on de anima and how Aristotelian psychology could be refitted to a contemporary philosophy of mind. Um, and there's some really cool work that especially was done, in the mid to late 20th century on a neo-Aristotelian philosophy of mind, which has been really cool. So that was kind of how I got into Aristotle. And then it wasn't really until the last couple of years that I've realized, oh, the thing that I want out of ethics is something like an Aristotelian virtue ethics, where you're
Uh-huh.
aiming to develop certain habits. You try to be a good person and you work towards being the sort of person who is good and who does
Huh.
certain things and who has dispositions towards good character traits. And that seems good. I don't know. I also just found
Yeah.
myself surrounded by a lot of Aristotelians and virtue ethicists who, you know, talked in very Aristotelian terms without me really realizing it. And I realized, like, oh, I want to be like them. Oh, that's virtue ethics. Okay, cool. Now I have a name for it.
Yeah. I wonder if we don't also almost have a little bit of that internalized just because some of Aristotle's thought came to us through Christianity. so it kind of seeped into Western thought, and then maybe that's just something that we kind of learn core aspects of, and then when we hear it, it just kind of rhymes with what we're already assuming, possibly.
Yeah, yeah, I think that that would make quite a lot of sense. I mean, I think a lot of us have some intuitive confusions
Hmm.
philosophically, I mean, across the board. But I like something I like about virtue ethics is that it's not outcome based.
Hmm.
And I think that a lot of people think of ethics or morality as well, there's sort of good intentions, good thoughts, and those are important. But then the good outcomes are a separate thing, and those are important
Hmm.
too. And it's really hard to square both of those together. And I think that I'm not as familiar, so I don't want to speak out of turn here, but I think that, Thomas Aquinas, Tommy Aqua, um, has been a big, or was a
That's my
big,
hip hop alias.
right? Isn't that great? Tommy Aqua. I have to remember, wait, what's the real name? But helped to, helped, I don't know, but shifted that a bit to square it with more, okay, well, punishment and reward, afterlife, Christian theology, all that jazz. I think it fits really nicely, and so we do have this sort of westernized, semi-Aristotelian intuitions about all of this, at least in Christian Western nations, I would say.
Sure, sure. So the reason that I kind of wanted to bring up this topic is just because I knew that you were interested in Aristotle, and I knew you had mentioned the ethics in passing on a tweet or something. And I jumped on the Stoicism bandwagon a couple years ago. Um,
Hmm.
and so it was, it's the Stoic revival is still running pretty strong. I wasn't I'd like to, I'm going to pretend that I'm sophisticated. I wasn't like the Ryan Holiday corporate stoicism. I was like the Massimo Pigliucci sophisticated, like real
Right, right.
philosopher stoicism. But,
Good.
how many ancient texts I actually engaged with were pretty minimal. A little Epictetus, a little Seneca, but
Hmm.
I thought maybe we could talk for just a moment about the different conceptions. And if this bores you, or if you're not interested in this, or this isn't your specialty enough, feel free to change the subject. But this idea of eudaimonia, this flourishing, this happiness that we're
Hmm.
aspiring towards. You had mentioned, you were interested in Plato at first, but then you kind of flipped and kind of developed more Aristotelian thought. I kind of
Hmm.
it's interesting what this eudaimonia is for the two types of virtue ethics, because both Stoicism and the Aristotelianism are both virtue ethics, but I think
Hmm.
they're very different. So I guess I could kick off some Stoic ideas off you right off, or if you want, I don't know if you have any comments right off the bat.
Yeah, I mean, I also was really into Stoicism for a bit there, and I
Cool.
think it's one of the more accessible philosophies as
Sure.
far as actually implementing it in the way you interact with the world.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that it has a lot of value in recognizing just how much is outside of your control, right? That,
Sure.
well, if you knew more about this situation, if you kind of went with the flow of things, then you probably would not waste as much emotional energy going through all of this.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And I think that taking taking that bit of it is really awesome. But
Sure.
at least for me, I went a little too hard with it, and I think that stoicism can be taken to the point where you end up suppressing a lot of your emotions
Hmm.
and not fully experiencing them, and that can ultimately be a lot more harmful. So
Hmm.
I at least for me it ended up becoming something like, well, I shouldn't feel this way, there's nothing I could have done, and so I would try and use these rational capacities that I have to push down those emotional experiences. So that's something that I've been thinking about, and I got really into embodied cognition and some of the different like externalist theories of mind. And embodied
Oh,
cognition in particular, there's a lot of really interesting empirical work done by psychologists. Peter Levine is one who talked quite a bit about it,
uh-huh.
where um, basically, like, not experiencing emotions fully, they end up sticking in your body, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
So, if you have a fight or flight mode, you have an antelope, fight or flight, they're constantly under incredible amounts of stress, almost being eaten by a lion or whatever.
Mhm,
But the reason that, gazelles don't really have anxiety, right, as far as we know, um, is because they fully experience that, right? They use all of that
mm,
anxiety they have, that
mhm.
immediate stress, and they have a burst of energy. They fully experience it. They run, and then
Yes.
once they're safe, they're fine. But
Mhm,
humans, because we're too smart for our own good, we are able to stop those feelings, to say, "Oh no, I'm stressed. Stop it." And
mhm,
instead, it holds that energy in our bodies and it embodies it, and so it
mhm,
can end up manifesting in all sorts of physical illnesses. And I know this sounds kind of
mhm.
woo, but like it's for real.
Yeah,
This is
it's really not woo. It's really
Yeah,
not.
it's not woo woo. It's something that many psychologists have talked about, and increasingly the embodied cognition literature in philosophy is supporting that. So I worry about how that connects with the sort of stoic view of flourishing, because I think that in order to flourish, there can't be a suppression, right? Like,
Absolutely,
even
yeah.
even visually, like, thinking about that metaphor, flourishing seems to be this growth outwards, and part of the Stoic view, as I understand it, is something like, well, you want to condition yourself to have the right sorts of responses, and
Mhm.
if you do that poorly, it can just be, controlling yourself and holding things in. So that's
Absolutely.
kind of the bit that I have on that. I haven't entirely thought about the eudaimonia between Stoicism versus Aristotle directly, but that's kind of the combination of thoughts I've had there.
Yeah, and I haven't seen really anybody give a good talk about the differences between the 2 conceptions of euda eud eudaimonia
There
either.
you go.
I was kinda hoping I saw Massimo Pigliucci talking to Dan Kaufman about, Stoicism one day, and I was really hoping they would get into the 2 different conceptions of it, but alas, they did not. Um, but, I wanted to say one more thing about embodying cognition real quick, and then I wanted to bring up another thing. I read a great book over Thanksgiving, just a short book called 7 and a Half Lessons About the Brain by this, neuroscientist, Lisa Feldman Barrett. And it's not only that you do what you were saying, you manifest whatever the traumatic experience or whatever it is that you go through, that you manifest that somehow physically and it can cause an illness, which that's certainly true. There's another little jagged piece to it, and that's that you adapt a physiological, behavioral, psychological, psychosomatic response to similar situations, and you begin to predict for the possibility of such a situation to occur again, because we have these predictive capacities with our rational
Right.
brains. So you start to see the world as a possible situation where you might have to have that response again, and you sort of anticipate it. And then that's why in this crazy technological and politically riotous climate, we just have so much anxiety, which is completely
Mhm.
understandable. But I want to
Oh,
just get to
yeah.
nuts and bolts. You alluded to this just in passing about Stoicism, that it's basically what they call is the dichotomy of control. And that's that some things, Epictetus delineated it as some things are within your control and other things are not. And if you're going to be worried about things that are outside of your control, that's going to give you all kinds of issues with that. Whereas you focus on the things that are in your control, it can be empowering. And I do think, even with your very valid critique of it, and I hope we can talk a little bit more about it, but even in your valid critique, I do think that that's still relevant in dealing with
Mhm.
these sorts of mind problems that we have.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, because I think nuts and bolts, when you get down to it, there there are things that you can control and there aren't. And
Yeah.
being able to figure out where that line is, or that gray area
Yeah.
is going to be kind of the way to figure out how to interact with the world. Um, and so I think that part of what's really nice about the Stoic picture is, their metaphysics, their world is completely deterministic, right? That
Hmm.
one thing happens, it hits another, two billiard balls hit one another, and that second billiard ball is always going to move, right? So you
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
deterministic world
Yeah.
where really, at a very fundamental level, everything's kind of predetermined and causally related. And what
Yep.
they were trying to sort out was, well, in a completely determined world, where does free will fit in? Or
Ah,
something like
yeah.
free will, where do we fit in? Because it seems
Sure.
like we can make actions and choose for ourselves. So, where does that fit? And especially now in the 21st century, where there are, however many 8, 9 billion people on Earth, and all of us are so powerless against the political climate, against all of the institutions we're a part of. It's sort of helpful to think about it in those terms, to say, okay,
Absolutely.
you know what? No, I really don't have much power in these situations. I can't control the outcomes. I can, aim to impact them, to influence them. I have a physical body that can do things, and I can use my voice to say things, and those can cause changes, but you really don't have any control over how those things come about, and
Hmm.
how the outcomes result from that. But I think
That's
that we just get so fuzzy in where that line is, to say, well, what can I control? I feel like I should be able to control how I'm feeling, or
yeah.
what I'm able to accomplish in a day, or how productive I am, or
Yep.
whatever it is. Whether I'm able
Yep.
to write and publish 18 papers in the first 3 years of a PhD, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you just you really got your finger on what uh, one of the things that kind of led me to start looking outside of stoicism myself, and that's that the sorry, I just had like 8 thoughts at once, so forgive me for being slow for
No, no,
but,
it's good.
so it's
Exciting.
great. So you know that there's all this deterministic physical reality, and you're trying to find that place, that site where volition can occur, right? Where you
Hmm.
can choose between, different options, and by choosing, you can potentially improve things for yourself. But then again, there's always that stump that you can stub your toe on, that sure, you have volition within the context of whatever you find yourself in, but it can seem liberating that, oh, I can choose to free my mind from this and still experience eudaimonia, because virtue is the highest good. It's a
Hmm.
greater good than any of the external conditions, which are beyond my control. It sounds like liberating, but the problem is, like you were saying earlier, you can repress things, right? But not
Right.
only can you repress things, you can also just rationalize things. And you can also, I found myself, I think, dissociating from
Hmm.
painful situations just by using my fancy pseudo ancient philosophy. It's like, oh, well, I don't have to let this bum me out because it's outside of my control. I don't, I have a cosmopolitan worldview, and I think of these people as my kin, and I could just, and I knew that it wasn't a pacifist philosophy. I knew that many Stoics, had emperors assassinated or whatever, like it wasn't a pacifist philosophy, but it did seem like sometimes I was just dissociating from the actual goings on rather than interacting with them. And then the other thing about it that I realized was once I started, it kind of a bunch of dominoes fell, because like Pigliucci was saying, so like let's say you have a problem and you're trying not to binge eat ice cream,
Hmm.
so you kind of decide that the easiest way to deal with the fact that you're struggling with that issue is to just not buy ice cream when you're at the grocery store. So I was like, okay, so you can do a pragmatic, practical thing to get around something, to like exercise volition. But then that started to cause dominoes to fall. And let me tell you what I mean.
Hmm.
I started realizing, okay, so I'm a social being and I'm capable of reason. Got it. One of the things that I can do to make my anxiety more manageable is to control my environment to the extent to which I can control my environment. For example, I can isolate, or I can only associate with certain people. And this all kind of mingles in, with stoicism and
Yeah,
everything. But eventually I started to realize my flourishing. I mean, I was reading a little bit of Epicureanism and seeing how they were arguing with the Stoics and stuff. I was like, there's really something to, like, if you can have a nice garden, you're going to feel happier than if you don't
right,
have a nice garden, right? And so I started to realize it's not just how I think about things, right? So there
right.
are material conditions that are involved in this, right?
Mhm. Yeah, so this is something I'm doing a Nicomachean Ethics reading group right now, and we've
Oh, nice.
3 meetings so far. We meet weekly for an hour and a half, and we've gotten through the first 5 chapters of book one. So that's like 8 pages, because there's just
Yeah.
so much there.
Yeah.
And this weekend, one of the pieces that comes up in the Nicomachean Ethics is, well, Aristotle says if you are raised experiencing the good things in life, so you're accustomed to fine wines and such, and you're
Hmm.
brought up, in the right way, then you're going to be better off, kind of morally, ethically. You're going to be closer to the good. That's
Hmm.
don't want to think the good in the Platonic sense, but you're closer to flourishing, or
Hmm.
you're at a better starting point at very least. And we had a big long conversation about this because it's like, well, this seems really classist and crummy. Are you
Hmm.
saying that you have to have a proper education in order to be properly happy? Isn't that's pretty convenient there for you, Aristotle, that the best life is one that resembles his.
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but the more we go talking about it, I think that there's something more like his recognition of the necessary material conditions for
Yeah.
happiness, right? That you
Absolutely.
can't flourish if you are on the street shivering cold. And you're not going to go out and ask somebody out on the street shivering cold without any shoes to say, hey, you seem happy. What's your secret? Right? And I
Right.
mean, there's nothing fundamentally about the Stoics' perspective that would preclude that person from being happy. And I mean, they could be happy.
Mhm.
But
Sure.
also, I think that it can have a lot of damage to say, yeah, in that material condition, you can be happy. So why aren't you? Right? There's nothing
Yeah.
external preventing your happiness. And I think that can be a problem as well. To say, no, no, it's not just, happiness is not a bootstrap situation where you can just, try harder and you'll be happy. If nothing else, then that's really ableist, right? For those struggling with mental illnesses. Um, but recognizing no, there are things outside of your control that are going to in some ways prevent you from reaching the good life, from at least easily achieving happiness and eudaimonia. Um, so I think that that's an important point that is sort of lacking from the Stoic perspective, is that recognition that if everyone around you is dying and sick, if there's a global pandemic and you are stuck in your house alone for 9 months, then yeah, it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, to reach eudaimonia or feel the full extent of flourishing as if you had friends, right? And you could go out and go to a pub with them and do trivia night. And I guess I'm kind of showing my cards for what I'm missing here, but
Sure.
you know,
Absolutely.
and that's an important point that I think a lot of Stoics, even contemporary like versions of Stoicism, don't recognize enough to validate. Hey, there are situations that are going to make it so you're not happy and not flourishing, and that's not your fault, and that's okay.
Right.
That taking away that burden can be helpful, because otherwise, if we are unhappy and we're a stoic, we're saying, well, why am I unhappy? I have the power to
Hmm.
make myself happy. And
Right.
then you can end up spiraling from that and feeling even worse about yourself because, oh, I can't even do stoicism right. I can't even,
Yeah.
the one thing I can control in life, apparently I can't control. And I think
Right.
that that can be even
Yeah.
worse and really like self-defeating there.
You just totally described the end of 2019 for me. That was like you just
Yep.
um, but of course, it's funny because then it comes full circle, though. Like, let's say I get cancer or something, and I'm in the hospital, and things are looking
Mhm.
pretty bleak, and I got to do chemo, and this is it.
Mhm.
This could be it, but my best chance of getting through it is to put this toxic poison in my body to hope that it kills the cancer. Then you have to deal with that, and then all of a sudden stoicism becomes useful again because you're like, well, how can I deal with the few things I could do to get I don't it's I love I like I said, I'm not actually proficient in actual philosophy, but I love thinking about these
No, no,
ideas.
it's good.
I came to it from literature myself. It just somehow I liked philosophical poets, and then just somehow I ended up stumbling into philosophy almost by accident.
I feel like that's
um,
how a lot of people get into it is,
you
oh
think so?
no, this thing I'm interested in, that's philosophy? Huh.
You're like,
Okay.
what?
All right.
Sure, sure. So thinking about that, just kind of like how philosophy can come to people naturally. You mentioned to me that you had a really good experience teaching at the Lyceum. Is that what it was called?
Yeah, the Lyceum.
The Lyceum.
Hmm.
Yeah, tell me
Yeah.
tell me about that.
Yeah. So the Iowa Lyceum is a pre-college philosophy camp that happens. It's a week long during the summer. We did it over Zoom this past summer.
Uh-huh.
And it's for students aged 13 to 18, and it's completely free for them. And they, do a little write up to say, hey, this is why I'm interested in this. And they come and spend a week listening to professors give lectures. um, it's run entirely by grad students, so there were 3 grad students from University of Iowa who worked on it this past semester or this past summer. And we just get to hang out with these high schoolers and talk to them about philosophy. And it's really cool because, at 14, 15, 16, I think a lot of people are trying to figure out what it is they want out of life. And they still
Sure.
have a lot of wonder, a lot of childhood wonder,
Yep.
and aren't as jaded. And
Yep.
have the curiosity while also recognizing that there are better and worse ways of thinking about the world, and they want to figure that out. And so it's kind of like the best possible teaching situation because it's a dozen or so kids who are just really excited about the content. So I was engaged with that last year. Was my first year, so we'll do it again this next year. Um, Open to students all over Iowa, though I'm hoping to try and get something up and running that's a little bit broader because there's an Iowa Lyceum, there's a Utah Lyceum that is hosted out of Southern Utah University, and there are a couple other similar programs that have cropped up. But that sort of thing, now that we know Zoom works, is there's no reason to keep it to just Iowa City folks, right? To Iowa
Oh,
City
heck
high
no.
schoolers. Have people from all over the country, all over the world, zooming in to talk about philosophy and interact with one another.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that you had lectures, and then what were there discussion sessions? Did they do writing exercises? Did they present anything themselves or
Yeah, so we meet from I think 9 to 2 Monday through Friday for a week, and it's broken up. So we'll have 45 minutes to start out of just, hey, what are you thinking about? Let's talk about some stuff. A lot of times we will assign readings. So this past year we had the theme surrounding identity, right? So identity broadly
Oh,
construed.
wow. Sure.
So we assigned a couple of readings. We actually have funding, so we were able to send them physical copies of books. So we sent them John Perry's Dialogues on Personal Identity, which is how I got introduced to conversations about identity when I was an undergrad, and a
Hmm.
couple other things, Descartes' Meditations and such. And we give them reading material. This time we didn't require them to read it, but I know the Utah Lyceum, they work with primary texts. They read Descartes, these 14,
Oh,
15 year
cool.
olds. read Descartes, talk about it. And then professors come in. We have University of Iowa professors. We have a fantastic faculty, and they volunteer and they'll come in and talk for. We have like an hour slot for them, and we really emphasize it being run sort of like a seminar rather than a lecture.
Hmm.
So, professors will come in and maybe do a 10-15 minute, hey, this is a PowerPoint talking about animal minds and how that relates to identity, for example. And then it'll be 45 minutes of high school students getting to ask all sorts of questions with
Oh,
professors.
cool.
And then we break away, the professors, we thank them, and then we have an hour and a half long discussion about it where the students just talk amongst themselves and the grad students facilitate to help keep it on task or to help answer some of the questions. Um, but it's fantastic. And then at the end of the week, they have a presentation or a debate they get to choose. So they can either work together, do it on their own, and based on what they read about, they can stick to the text, they can figure something else out. We spend Wednesday and Thursday, we give them quite a bit of time to basically do research and think about different topics they're interested in. And then they get to work with grad students in philosophy to develop some sort of presentation or to have a debate, to have a free will debate or whatever it is. And then on Friday, we invite the parents, or in this case, give them the Zoom link, parents and whoever else wants to come hear them speak, and they give their presentations. And they're incredible. They're amazing. I mean, this past one, we had a bunch of kids from the speech and debate team, so they were pretty comfortable with speaking, but
Yeah.
there was a talk on virtue ethics that somebody did of Socratic versus Platonic versus Aristotelian virtue ethics, and it was incredible. And the PowerPoint was full of SpongeBob. It was all SpongeBob things, and it
Oh,
was
wow.
the most amazing presentation I've ever seen. And it was a 16-year-old talking about these things. So it's really a magical experience, and I really think that more programs, full stop, more universities and colleges and things like that really should do something like this. Because I mean, it's a week
Yeah.
long, it's not a ton of work to get it up and running, especially if it's online. I mean, for in person, it requires a bit more planning and paperwork and such. But it's a really fantastic opportunity for everyone involved. I mean, the grad students get to interact with really enthusiastic young scholars and get to, kind of troubleshoot how they talk about things, in this same way that I mentioned earlier that, I love talking with people not in philosophy because I realize where I have gaps. I can skip over 20 steps in talking about something and not realize it until somebody who isn't in philosophy goes, "Wait, how did you get there?" And I realize, "Oh, I don't know how I got there." And so that's a really incredible opportunity for professors and grad students to engage with high school students like that. And it's really awesome for the high school students because they don't really get any opportunity to interact with philosophy at all. And they come into college and there's a philosophy program, but if they don't know what it is, nobody's going to take a philosophy class. And I think
Right.
we're seeing that more and more.
That's a really good way to delineate it. The fact that you go so many steps without knowing whether or not the person is there. That kind of goes with any kind of specialization, right? When you're in a field, there are certain assumptions that are taken for granted, right? And then the group
Hmm.
of you who are in that special field, you all run with that. And then before you know it, it becomes very esoteric completely.
Right.
Other people from outside of the sphere simply don't know what you're talking about. And I've been watching a lot of videos by this guy in Milwaukee, Dr. Gregory Sadler, who does a
Oh
thing
yeah,
called, you know him? Yeah. Well,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
he's in
He's good.
Stoicism. So, yeah. And anyway, he always talks on at the beginning, how a lot of philosophical topics really aren't so complex that a typical mind can't grasp them, but it's just that the context of reading academic writing to get into it,
Yeah.
there's a lot of barriers there. And
Right.
I know you were kind of talking about this on one of your Twitter threads. You mentioned you were just talking about a software, and you were saying, hey, this software, it's not
Hmm.
great for underprivileged kids, and that was a loose term, but kids who have financial obstacles, who might have to use their computer in a public facility. They're going to have a problem accessing this, and then
Mhm.
you hear that coming up a lot with conversations about privilege and stuff like that. Did any of that come up in your experience last summer? Did as far as how they talked about identity and stuff?
You mean like with privilege, or with the more general language barriers of getting into things?
Any of the above?
Yeah,
That doesn't make it easier on you. That was a poorly phrased question. My
no,
fault.
no, it's good. It's good. I mean, there are a lot of good points there that you said. I guess going back a minute, I do think that it's really hard, especially when you're in the brunt of research and a graduate philosophy career, or any academic career, any specialization. It's really hard to step away from it and figure out how to communicate the things you're thinking about
Mhm.
in language that's accessible. And I think that
Sure.
accessible language is a really important skill. Like, the ability to communicate is a really important skill, and there's a lot of value in teaching for that exact reason. Because if you're not able to communicate your ideas as a philosopher, as an engineer, as whatever, and you're trying to teach people how to do these things, they're going to have no idea what's going on. So it kind
Mhm.
of forces your hand in those ways.
Right.
And I think you're exactly right. And I guess Gregory Sadler is exactly right in saying that a lot of philosophy, I think basically anyone can do philosophy, right? It's seen as this thing that only intellectuals, that only brilliant people can do. But I don't think that's right. I think that anybody can think about these things. And I think that a lot of people do think about a lot of things that we talk
I
about in
think
philosophy. They just
I
don't
think
have the
almost
language.
everyone does some kind of philosophy in some way or
Yeah.
another. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. Like, even, 14, 15-year-olds sitting up all night hanging out with their friends, they all end up talking about philosophy, right? That's what everybody loves, is the deep conversations that happen under the stars, kind of thing. Is how I
Yeah,
picture it.
yeah.
But I think that there's such a massive barrier in philosophical language and academic writing in general, that part of it is, you know, only a portion of it is being really precise, right? Especially analytic philosophers, they pride themselves in being precise in how they talk about things, and that can end up being very dense. And especially Aristotle, right? He seems very dry and dense, and he is really dense, but he's also very intentional with the way he speaks about things, right? Or I guess
Mhm.
writes about things. He's not speaking much anymore. um, but figuring out how to read the way philosophers think and write is basically learning a whole new language. And it has a massive learning curve. But I think that it's really valuable as a philosopher to be able to translate, to say, okay, well, basically what's going on here is. And this is something I went to the National Humanities Alliance conference, and Barry Lamb, I think, was the one talking about it.
Oh.
Because he does the True Phil Sci. No, not the Hi-Fi Nation. Oh, I don't remember. I'm sorry.
Oh.
But he has a podcast, a philosophy podcast, and they were talking about how, because philosophers are so caught up in precision and being accurate and articulate and intentional in how they talk about things, there's a big barrier to public philosophy and communicating philosophical ideas to the public in general, because they're not willing to cut corners. And when they do cut corners to say, well, basically it's this, broad strokes, you have 100 other philosophers jumping down your throat saying why that's bad philosophy. But it turns
Yeah.
out, just public philosophy and trying to communicate these ideas colloquially is really hard. And you have to
Mhm.
be kind of imprecise with that. And I mean, they do that in science, right? We take science classes growing up, and the stuff they
Mhm.
teach you in elementary and middle school is basically wrong. Like, it's oversimplified to
Exactly.
the point of being wrong.
Yeah.
And scientists are good at that, because the further you get, you learn how to engage with science, and you learn the processes, and you learn more and more technically as we go on. And I think that part of philosophy's problem in trying to be so precise, um, is that philosophers aren't willing to cut corners and sort of work their way through. So reading Descartes with high school students or undergrads, even reading it, um, it's hard to read in a lot of ways and pull out everything and really have the correct interpretation, whatever that means.
Hmm.
But also, you can read it so long as you have someone there to kind of translate, right? This is
Sure.
why translator commentaries for ancient texts are awesome. Say, like, yeah, he says this, he probably means something like this, and, however it works. That you need a little help, and it needs to be watered down a little bit and maybe a little imprecise so that you can get those broad strokes and see, okay, this is how philosophy is done, this is how it's written. And then you go on and you do things more intensely and get more technical, and the exact words matter a bit more and things like that. But I think there's such a move, or so much pressure to avoid that, because it's betraying the discipline in some way. But I think that that's not the way to do it. So yeah. All right, I lost my train of
Yeah,
thought too.
just to
I got
just
excited,
to
but yeah.
no, no, that's okay. But I mean, to be charitable to the university, I mean, the reason that that happened is because the incentive to, strive for the positions of authority in those institutions, demanded that you be competitive. And anytime there's any kind of competition, like, uh, well, now I can't even use simple words, so I hope you feel better. Um, Everything gets more and more complex the more
Mhm,
competition there is, right? So
mhm,
it's in some ways it's just like, okay, that just happened. I mean, it's the way of things and markets. But what there are two things I wanted to bring up though. One is you mentioned, that high schoolers still have this sense of wonder.
mhm,
And I was thinking too, not only do they have the sense of wonder, but they also haven't been like driven through this ideology through a system of rewards and punishments, right? Like once you leave school and you have to get a job and figure out your way in the world, you just go through this system of rewards and punishments that really like just pushes this ideology in, this kind of it's not just consumerism, it's this all kinds of different ideology. But
mhm,
and high schoolers simply haven't gone through that process of indoctrination yet, so you could still get them engaging with curiosity in a lively way that's just a lot, has a lot more energy. uh
mhm,
but the other thing I wanted to say is, you were mentioning the problem with the institutionalization of philosophy. It makes it very difficult to bridge that gap between
mhm,
the academy and those young, fresh, excited minds, because you have to go through all those steps. How do I communicate with these people?
mhm.
And this gets into why I wanted to talk to you about ethics, because now more than ever, we have needed philosophy. It seems like absolutely, like possibly human life on this planet depends on philosophy at per, at this particular moment, in my opinion. Like the ability, and it's not just quote unquote critical thinking. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a way to look at your values intuitively and rationally, and to figure out what do I value and why, and how is that influencing not only myself and my health and behavior, but also how I interact with others, and other people's healths and behaviors are influencing me as well as the ecosphere. So it's never been more important to try to figure out how to bridge this gap of specialization to just, the common population. And it seemed like you might appreciate that uniquely because you had the opportunity to recently work with high schoolers.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right. And I mean, not to follow in Aristotle's footsteps here, but yeah, philosophy seems really important to the world right now, says the philosopher. But no, I think that that's right, and I think that a lot of folks go through, even well educated, brilliant folks go through engineering, go through business, go through all sorts of things. And they think about, well, what are the ethical implications of my work? And it's kind of like, well, don't take bribes, right? That's
Hmm.
the thing. Well, just don't take bribes and I'll be doing ethical work. And
Right.
there's a lot
But
more
then
truth to that.
meanwhile, they still maintain the motivations that make them susceptible to want to take bribes. So
Or
that
even just recognizing, like, I'm getting really into AI ethics and ethics of algorithms and such. And
I was hoping to ask you about that. Yeah.
I see things and it's like, oh, we're going to use facial recognition software to see how friendly you are. Like this
Yeah.
new recognition software says how friendly you are, and um, people who are hiring can use this in the interview, and you get a friendliness score based on this.
Yeah.
And
And I'm like,
that
what are the
has
jobs where
nothing to do
unfriendly people can get them? Like,
that's so
I want the
problematic.
unfriendly job.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're not aware of the ethical implications, or if you're not slowing down to think about that, or if you don't have the awareness of the resources of people writing about why that's an issue, you're just off in your own world making this software, then you're putting out really, really problematic things. And going
Yeah.
back to the proctoring software you mentioned earlier, I think that's a perfect example of it, right? Where, oh, everybody's moved to home, everybody's doing classes from home, we still have to do tests. How do we make sure that they're not cheating? Well, we use
Yeah.
proctoring software. Proctoring
Uh-huh.
software, okay, what does it do? It turns on our camera, it turns on the speakers, it requires you to take a video of your space around you to ensure that you don't have any notes sitting around.
Yeah.
Um, and the speaker's on the whole time so that they can hear if anyone's telling you the answers or if there's anyone else in the room. And it
Ugh.
watches your eye movements. So if you are
Ugh.
away from the camera, it marks that and flags it. And so already you're like, whoa, that's really invasive. But even
Yeah.
further than that, it doesn't take into account, as you said, the folks, the students from underprivileged households, right? Who, may not want their professors to see what their space is like. There's a reason there are fake Zoom backgrounds you can put on, right? Not everyone has the luxury of a nice, clean space that's their own, that they can do exams from. Not everyone can be in a quiet testing environment when they're at home, especially not with short notice the way we did with the pandemic.
Yeah.
Um, it required you to show your driver's license and then take a picture of your face, right? So it's
Yeah.
making sure that you are the same one taking the exam that's supposed to be taking the exam. But I mean,
Yeah.
if you are transitioning, if you've gained weight, lost weight, if you're sick,
Yep.
if anything like that, it's going to flag that. And
Yep.
professor's going to see, oh, according to this, your driver's license has your dead name and has the wrong gender because you're not out, whatever it is. That's really
Hmm.
problematic, right? And
Absolutely.
I'm sure that that's not something that they were thinking about when they developed this technology. So those are the kinds of things that I think that it's really important for philosophers to be able to do this public facing work. And I think that a lot of AI ethics stuff is really um, is good in this way. There's a lot of bad AI ethics stuff out there that's published, I think. But
Sure.
I think that AI ethicists are a group that's more able to communicate with its base because they're more interactive with it than,
Hmm.
say,
Hmm.
academic philosophers proper doing ethics or philosophy, history of philosophy, or something like that. Um, but there still has to be that motivation from individuals in engineering in on the other side, right, who are saying, okay, let me listen, let me learn, right, let me realize that I don't know everything here, and having that virtue of intellectual humility, right, that's
Hmm.
one of the big things that needs to happen. And I think that that's something really valuable that philosophy ought to teach. I'm not sure if it always does, but just the recognition, if I were 15 or 16 listening to philosophers talk about all of these things and being really excited about how the world works, it's really hard not to care about that, not to internalize, oh, wow, yeah, interesting. There are problems in the world and there are different ways of looking at them, and that's really cool. And I think that that can impact people for a really long time as they're going forward to say, all right, well, I don't want to be the sort of person who implements really racist facial recognition software and is responsible for, disproportionately incarcerating black men in high crime areas, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, yeah. That's my rant about that. But I think
Well, it
that you're
also,
right, that it is really important right now, with how the world is in so many different ways, to slow down and think and listen and recognize all of the things that are going on, and that philosophy kind of requires that slow thinking. Philosophy in its ideal form. Obviously, there's a lot going on with a lot of problematic transphobic philosophy going on right now. But philosophy in its ideal form, I think, requires slow thinking when it's done well. And I think that a lot of people would do well to slow down and think about what's important and what the implications of their actions are.
absolutely. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about virtue ethics in specifics was because, it's there's so much complexity in all of these issues
Hmm.
that it's really to make your philosophy more complicated is to really do yourself a disservice in this kind of climate. And one of the things I liked what Dan Kaufman, I read an essay he wrote about Aristotelianism, and he said, one of the nice things about it is it doesn't tell you what to do in situations. It tells you how to think about flourishing so that you can find out what is the right thing to do in situations. And
Right.
that's because otherwise, in this kind of complex world, if you're going around beating yourself over the head trying to overanalyze or if I got to remember the 3 points that I'm supposed to think whenever I make a moral judgment,
Right.
that's just gonna crush you. You're gonna be a ball of anxiety that's just
Hmm.
creating as much destruction as we don't need any more destruction.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that that's right. I think that virtue ethics is one of the the most well suited ethical theories for navigating complexity, because I think it's a problem to think about there being a right outcome. I think that can add a lot of undue stress to think about, well, there is one best outcome, full stop, and if I figure out what that best outcome is, then I've done the right thing. um, and instead focusing more on, well, I'm going to work towards being the sort of person who cares about and thinks about the right kinds of things. Say, well, I want to be a kind person. I want to be a generous person. And in my interactions with the world, I'm going to try to be generous, and I'm going to try and do that over and over again. And you're probably going to end up a better person, right? Say, I'm going to try and be more patient. And as they say, patience is a virtue. So trying to be more
Hmm.
patient with things, to say, all right, well, this situation is really testing my patience, but it's also um, the sort of situation that requires me to stand up, right? And so weighing those virtues against one another, to say, okay, is this a situation that demands I be generous and charitable, or is this a situation where I need to come in hard for what I believe, right? And those sorts of reflections, and having all of those quote unquote good features or these virtues that come into our thought process as we're interacting with the world, or even just kind of intuitively, that I knee jerk do the more generous thing, or I'm kind instead of frustrated. That seems like the best case scenario, and that's going to help me in any case. And whether I end up doing the right thing or not, I can still, quote unquote, right thing, best outcome. I can still reflect and say, look, I am trying to be a good person. I learned that this situation doesn't demand I be generous, it demands I be courageous, or whatever it ends up being. And in the end, otherwise, I think you can end up forgetting or losing a lot of the values that I think we want to have. If you're just thinking about how do I help the most people, then there are a lot of other good things in the world. There's not just one good way of interacting with the world, there are a lot of good ways. And I think that virtue ethics really engages with that nicely so that it accounts for all of those different ways of interacting, and you can say, okay, well, this is as generous or as kind or as patient as I can be, and that's okay, and I can still be better in the future, and I'm going to aim to be that in the future. And I think that's a really healthy emotional way of interacting with the world. I don't know, I think my therapist would approve.
A very inspiring call to aspiration. Cassie, it has been an absolute delight talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, this was great.